Hello and welcome to The Edge. Well, we'll take an in-depth analysis of today's top stories by looking beyond the edge. We'll bring you not just the facts, but also deep insights into the topics, with expert opinions and social media reactions. Let's make a start with our look beyond the edge. French President Emmanuel Macron said that he hopes to close a rift with US counterpart Joe Biden when the pair meets in Rome at the end of October, saying that he wants the longtime allies to work together once again in good faith. Reconciliation, a group of 20 summits, would potentially end a transatlantic row triggered last month by the US negotiation in secret of a military pact known as AUKUS, with Australia and Britain to counter China, excluding France. Can France and the United States overcome the disagreement? British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says that there is no crisis in the United Kingdom and links the recent problems seen in petrol and food logistics to the revival of the economy. He added that a difficult winter, the petrol crisis, empty supermarket shelves and rising energy prices are just symptoms of the country's economic path, which is trying to overcome lack of productivity, low wages, lack of investment in energy and infrastructure. But what in reality is the economic situation in Britain? And the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, is considering the launch of a rolling review of Merck's experimental COVID-19 pill. MOLNUPIRAVIR is an experimental antiviral pill developed by Merck, which could halve the chances of dying or being hospitalized for those most at risk of contracting severe COVID-19. Will this new drug make it easier to treat COVID-19 patients without hospitalization? And these are the top three topics that we'll be taking a look at today from Beyond the Edge. Let's get started. New security partnership in the Asia-Pacific will see the United Kingdom and the United States provide Australia with the technology and capability to deploy nuclear-powered submarines. But what are the details of the pact? Our infographic explains. During his visit to Paris, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that he seeks to restore French trust and rebuild diplomatic relations amid the AUKUS tensions.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Tuesday he would have a chance during talks in Paris to discuss restoring French trust in the United States following a row over a new Indo-Pacific security pact. Blinken is in Paris seeking to rebuild diplomatic relations after the pact between the United States, Australia and Britain resulted in Canberra scuttling a $40 billion defence contract for French submarines. Asked how he would reassure the French that the United States could be trusted, Blinken said ahead of his talks with French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian that the two will have a chance to talk later. The French government has said it was stabbed in the back by its close allies and that it would take time for the wounds to heal. France briefly withdrew its ambassador to the United States over the affair.
I'm now joined live from Birmingham in England by Scott Lucas, who's Professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham, and from Ankara in Turkey by Kyle Inan, who's a geopolitical analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today on The Edge. Scott, let me come to you first. There's some rapprochement going on behind the scenes with Antony Blinken speaking to his French counterparts. The Biden administration has admitted that it made some lack of communications ahead of AUKUS. Where do you see things standing at the present time?
Just as this was never a full split, this was never a dissolution, divorce of the partnership, so this is not a full reconciliation. France was angered. Not only at the fact that this Australia-UK-US pact had replaced its contract for submarines with Australia, but at the manner of it. And the Americans, Biden administration, have publicly as well as privately said, yes, they mishandled this by not consulting Paris, or indeed Asian allies, before announcing this suddenly last month. But at the same time, the idea that the French will take nothing away from this, that this is a reconciliation, that's too much going in the other direction. It was notable that when Secretary of State Blinken and French Foreign Minister Le Drian appeared yesterday, Le Drian said very little in terms of, oh, this is a positive, productive meeting, just simply waved away reporters' questions. In other words, not only France, but other European countries, well, they'll continue to be allies in NATO, many of them. They'll continue to be allies in other partnerships, economic partnerships. But the idea that Europe simply follows an American lead, that idea that we got used to during the Cold War and be gone, I think that's gone. And I think the question now is on a case-by-case basis, whether it's dealing with Europe, whether it's dealing with Asia, whether it's dealing with the Middle East or Africa, you have to look at France and you have to look at other European countries and say, all right, what are their interests? Are their interests simply being in lockstep with the Americans, or are they going to try to carve out an independent foreign policy, and indeed beyond that, although it is a very ambitious goal that has not been achieved in recent years, will they pursue an independent military force?
So some interesting changes afoot. Kyle, let me ask you, this different solutions for different situations. Have the French overreacted? What's your take?
And to be perfectly honest, I think we are quite lucky that the relations have been restored almost back to normal. I think there was a strong rift that would have come apart completely because $50 billion, we're talking about $40 to $50 billion. So it's like $5 to $10 billion for each submarine, for each on the shoulder of each Australian taxpayer's money. I believe it was Antony Blinken, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Paris right now speaking with the OECD Secretary General, talking some commercial deals in the West African region. But when he was there, for some of our viewers that are not informed, Secretary Blinken is a native French speaker, so he speaks excellent French. And he was taking questions in French yesterday, and I think it was one of the French journalists asking the Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, saying, hey, was it not possible for you to communicate us directly that this was forming this pact was your intention all along? And then Secretary Blinken responded, hey, we could have been we could have more gracefully done that, but actually the situation called for it. Now, I believe President Biden has already made a phone call with President Macron to ease tensions. I believe that's well received. Plus, Secretary Blinken was not scheduled to meet with President Macron during his visit to France, but President Macron received Secretary Blinken, so I think that's a step towards good relations. But I think we're far away from saying that everything's restored back to normal, and I think France will ask for major concessions in the years to come.
So, Scott, I hadn't realised that Blinken was a French speaker. So, excuse me for speaking the truth, but for an American, it's a big asset to have a second language like that. How does this bode for helping to restore the relations? And what do you see coming at the end of the month when Joe Biden and Macron maybe get the chance to speak face to face?
Well, I think you're right to note that the fact that Secretary Blinken was raised in Paris, that he speaks French, was part of the relatively high hopes that Europeans had, not just the French, with the Biden administration succeeding Donald Trump, who, of course, was very destructive of the transatlantic relationship. But I think having raised those hopes, that's why it's been so significant in the summer and autumn, that they have been, if not completely dashed, disappointed. I think the first strike was the manner of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which affected not only, of course, Afghans, but European allies who had been involved in the international coalition there. That disaster was followed by this second strike, at least for the French, and potentially for others like the Germans, of the manner of the AUKUS pact. The question is whether there'll be a third strike. I think if the Biden administration truly puts itself back on a platform of working with Europeans rather than simply imposing what we might call diktats, then we might see, in other words, well, lines being drawn together rather than apart on key issues, like, for example, how you respond to what is effectively Russian aggression that affects Europe, how you respond, for example, on issues of transnational importance, such as climate change, coronavirus pandemic. But if there is a third strike, it could come about because the Biden administration has tended to follow an American first policy, not only in its rhetoric, but in some of its attitudes towards its allies. Joe Biden was very explicit about this American first approach at the UN, even as he talked about climate change and coronavirus. And that American first approach in Afghanistan and in the Indo-Pacific has carried cost. And to accept the Europeans to simply accept the cost, indeed, as we have seen in recent years, to accept Turkey simply to go alongside the United States, even though it is a NATO member, I think that is an expectation we can no longer hold.
Right, and to pick up your baseball allegory there, that little I know about the sport, 3 strikes and you're out. Is there, Kyle, is there a risk that America is pushing itself into a corner where countries around the world can no longer trust it? I
believe diplomatic relations have definitely been tested at that point, Andy. But I think simultaneously, France realizes the critical threat that China is posing in the South China Sea in the Pacific region. Australia, of course, has every right to protect its borders, commercially, economically, politically speaking. And I think the 12 submarine deal, if we were to get into a bit of a technicality over it, then why has the deal not worked so well? Well, France could have told Australia, well, Australia, you should have told me that my submarines were a little short in range and that my submarines were easily detectable compared to what UK and US would offer. But you still accepted signing the deal. And Australia, on the other hand, was saying, hey, you know what? I told you I was going to break the deal because I thought that I needed to get the best components for my deal, saying I need the good infrastructure, good cyber security and AI infrastructure to get the deal going.
So, Scott, will the French find a way of becoming part of this defense against China?
Well, the Americans have not defined this so that France is part of the military first approach to China. That's what one signal of the Australia-UK-US deal is. It's another signal of the American emphasis on the Quad with India, Japan, and Australia. But perhaps even more important, France, and I slightly differ here with Kyle's excellent remarks, France doesn't want to be part of a military first approach in an anti-China front. Certainly, France was very interested in making the money off the arms deal with Australia, but they do not necessarily agree that the line with China should be one of confrontation, which is what the Americans are risking at points, while also talking about competition. And secondly, the French, and not only the French, but other European allies, do not believe in a military first approach to Beijing. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Union president, hours before the AUKUS deal was announced last month, set out the idea of a European global gateway, which was to compete with or to complement, in some ways, the China approach of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, how do you compete with the Chinese and potentially have a win-win situation. You do it through economic and social and development initiatives. You don't do it by trying to stoke confrontation and making the South China Sea the priority of your policy when there are so many other areas of the world where China's really making gains. The South China Sea gets headlines, but the far more important issue for the French and for the Europeans is who sets up the 21st century economic system that benefits, well, developed areas of the world, but of course benefits France and Europe as well.
Well, there's the big question to be discussed another time. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here today on The Edge and your fascinating analysis. Thank you. The top US diplomat was trying to rebuild ties after the AUKUS pact resulted in Canberra scuttling a defence contract initially valued at $40 billion for French submarines. French officials have emphasised that AUKUS was a wake-up call for EU states and that they should respond to the recent crisis between Paris and Washington by ending the bloc's naivety when it comes to defending its interests and building its own military capacity within the NATO framework. The coming weeks will show how the ties develop. For now, let's move on to our next topic to speak about the economic situation in the UK, where a shortage of lorry drivers has caused problems for a range of industries in recent months, from supermarkets to fast food chains. Our following infographic explains. Amid fuel supply and driver shortage issues affecting the UK, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says that he believes the country should adopt a new approach, with businesses urged to invest in people rather than relying on cheap imported labour.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson put the country's supply chain disruption down to pressures from global growth in an interview at his party's annual conference on Tuesday. In an interview with the BBC, Johnson said he was confident British businesses had the expertise and skill to work around disruption to supply chains.
We will help with visas and on all the rest of it. We'll help with all the supplementary labour that is requested. But in the end, this is a problem of global growth.
Asked about pigs being culled as a result of a shortage of abattoir workers, he pointed out that it is one of the features of the meat processing industry that animals are slaughtered.
Some of the people who have been writing to me may be worried about this, but I'm not worried about this because actually I think it would be good for their businesses to invest in people. I'm looking forward to it very much. I don't know whether I'm actually going to be there, but I'm looking forward to it very much.
Earlier on Tuesday, Johnson said there would be no 1970s-style inflationary spiral and demanded that businesses kick a decades-long addiction to cheap imported labour. With fuel companies and supermarkets warning that a shortage of drivers was hitting deliveries, the government said in late September that it would temporarily reverse its immigration rules and give 5,000 visas for EU drivers to operate in Britain.
And to discuss this, I'm joined live from London by Adam Schwartz, who's a political commentator. Adam, thank you for joining us here today on The Edge. I know in politics there's always more than one perspective, usually two totally opposing perspectives, and the spin is all very good, but on the one hand, Boris Johnson says it's a giant waking up of the economy, and on the other hand, my father was talking to me the other day about concerns about shared by many other British residents about the rising costs of fuel. What is the real situation in Britain right now?
Well, I think to some extent they're both right. We have a sort of very difficult combination of events and circumstances that have been combined with enormous and very abrupt structural change with the exit of the UK from the single market and the customs union at the beginning of the year. So I think to some extent, like all countries, the UK is suffering from issues caused by the pandemic. And of course, the global economy is recovering, and it's recovering at a much faster rate than some expected, which is causing some issues because certain countries and industries simply don't have the industrial capacity to return to the kind of output levels that they were previously doing before the pandemic. So that's certainly causing issues. But we have issues, particularly in the UK, where we have labour shortages are causing supply disruption, as your infographic demonstrated, that are causing issues that we're really not seeing in comparable economies across Europe. And it's affected, right across the supply chain in the UK, from fuel to food to gas. And so really we're seeing an immediate impact upon consumers that's kind of been building over the past few months, really. And to some extent, the government has tried to play down some of these issues the last few months. But finally, the government seems to be in a position where it cannot deny them because it's so obvious to everyone what's happening really around us, particularly this last week with issues of fuel deliveries to petrol stations. So the government's sort of shifting its narrative away from denial to basically trying to frame what we're seeing at a consumer level as some kind of deliberate economic strategy, as Johnson mentioned in his conference speech today, moving from sort of a low-paid, low-skill economy towards a high-paid, high-skill economy. To some extent, to me, this seems to be more of a kind of political PR campaign rather than a description of the reality of the situation. And as of yet, we're still yet to see any indications that the government is really willing to put the steps necessary to resolve any of these issues.
And this is really what I was trying to pick up on. The quote that you just referenced, talking about moving, getting away from a mainline low-wage, low-cost economy to where people are valued for what they are. These don't sound like Conservative talking points.
I think that's absolutely correct. To me, this seems to be the most ideologically confused Conservative Party that really we've kind of seen in modern times. We're used to actually the debate being kind of flipped, where the Labour Party would generally be trying to push for increase in wages, and trying to make sure that, some of the kind of industrial changes that the Conservative Party is trying to enact, they tend to be arguing that way, but actually it seems to be the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson. They're trying to position themselves more as the party of sort of high intervention, particularly to increase living standards. To some extent, I think they've sort of got the wrong end of the stick here. The UK really is, a high-skilled, to some extent, a high-paid economy. The issue is actually how that relates to the cost of living in the UK. Compared to other comparable economies around the world, we've got a very high cost of living, high cost of energy, high cost of food. And part of the problem is that the Conservative strategy to increase wages artificially through shortages, essentially, will actually ultimately lead to an increase in inflation, because we all know that businesses are not simply going to absorb those costs added by the supply chain issues. And so ultimately, those costs are going to be passed on to consumers. And so I'm not sure that the Conservatives really are going to achieve their objective or their vision that was set out today if you have wage increases that are essentially being negated by increases in cost of living.
I saw a figure yesterday that suggested that there's a 3% current inflation in the UK, which, from my memory, is quite high. Now, of course, post-pandemic around the world, many countries are seeing inflation. Is there any kickback to that?
So I think, yeah, that's absolutely correct. We're about 3.2% based on the last reading. It's expected to be around 4% by the end of the year, possibly even higher. The Bank of England's target rate is about 2%. So we're really looking at, at the moment, at least 50% higher than that. And to some extent, at the moment, we're not seeing major consumer anger at particularly the price increases, because I think to some extent consumers are used to price increases taking place over, frankly, decades. The main issue that consumers are facing is just the issue of availability of items in shops. And to some extent, prices is one issue, but if you can't get your hands on the goods, or if the quality of the goods is not as good as it used to be because of supply chain disruption, that seems to be the thing that consumers are mainly kicking onto at the moment. But I think, really over the next year and a half, as we see inflation climb even higher, that's when this will become, I think, a major political football that I imagine the opposition Labour Party will seek to capitalise on.
So maybe a rollercoaster ride ahead in British politics. Let's come back to the fuel prices. The British Army is now stepping in to help deliver fuel, I believe, in the south and in the north of the country. Things I'm also hearing are gradually returning to normal. So there's diseven distribution across the country. I can't think of a better way of framing that. How is that happening?
Yes, well, there's certainly regional disparities that we're seeing in terms of issues that we're having. As you mentioned, in Scotland and in Northern England, Wales, Northern Ireland, the issue seems to be getting a lot better, whereas in London and the southeast, we're still seeing about 13% of petrol stations basically having no fuel whatsoever. 13%, may not sound like a huge number, but actually that has a huge impact upon consumer behaviour. We're still seeing huge lines really across the capital where I am. I think one of the issues is that just basically the distribution of cars within the UK, and I think obviously cities are a particular hub for fuel, and obviously. The UK is very London-centric, and I think that's really one of the main reasons we're seeing it. But I think it's also worth recognising that while there were issues with getting fuel to petrol stations, actually to some extent the issues were sort of demand-related. And there was this leak that basically the government was going to start prioritising fuel to certain stations about a week ago. And that's what really prompted this huge surge in demand that's caused the issues, because to some extent across the country we don't have a shortage of petrol. It's just an issue of actually getting it from the depots to the petrol stations themselves. So the main reason why we have these regional disparities is essentially sort of demand related and due to conditions on the ground. So
as you say, the panic buying that was totally unnecessary, but happened because there are humans involved. The one industry which stands to see positive changes or hope for positive changes is of course, that of the heavy goods drivers. They've been able to put to the forefront the difficulties, the challenges they've had in conducting their work. Is there a move to improve their conditions in a hope to encourage more people to get back behind the wheel, or people to start a new career behind the wheel?
Yes, so the government sort of has a two-pronged approach to this. So one, it has created a 3-month visa for European workers to try to entice them back to the UK. Because if we look at numbers compared to where we were pre-pandemic, out of about 40,000 EU drivers that were in the UK before, about 15,000 of those that have left. Now, that doesn't account for all of the problems we have. We have a shortage of about 100,000 drivers, but it's hoped that would try to bring some drivers back. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have worked particularly well. We had figures released yesterday that showed that only 127 people out of 5,000 available visas made available were actually people had actually taken up that opportunity from Europe. So I would hope that more people would take advantage of that. But I think certainly, the very difficult driving conditions that we've had in the UK because of the shortage, and just due to the delays, actually that's not an offer that seems to be taken up in continental Europe. But in terms of what the government's sort of long-term strategy, the government is trying to basically get more domestic capacity, get more local drivers, and basically the way that it's been doing that is by loosening the requirements to actually become a heavy goods vehicle driver in the UK. They've shortened the period in which you have to basically be training, and they've also shortened the test rather worryingly, such as not making reversing in a lorry a requirement to be tested on. Just one of the things that I fear with this is that it's swapping one problem for another. We may have a crisis of safety on the roads that we would be swapping for trying to desperately get more heavy good vehicles, more drivers essentially. But unfortunately, this is not something that has a quick fix. And actually, for trying to create more domestic capacity, this is something that takes years to complete. And so the fact that the government's only thinking about it now, to me, shows real a lack of a long-term strategy and long-term planning.
Yes, obviously, these things need to be planned through. Well, we will see where it goes. There's still 2 months for Christmas. I know several politicians are worried about their Christmas Day roast. Let's hope that the supply chains are sorted out long before then. Adam Schwartz, thank you so much for joining us today with your in-depth analysis. Thank you. A shortage of an estimated 100,000 HGV drivers has negatively affected the economy. Supermarkets open their doors to customers with empty shelves more often. The coming days will show how the British government deals with the situation. Now let's move on to our final topic to speak about the experimental COVID drug, MOLNUPIRAVIR. Merck is the first company to report trial results of a pill to treat COVID. Our following infographic has more. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced on Tuesday that the country will buy 300,000 doses of Merck's experimental antiviral pill.
Australia will buy 300,000 courses of an experimental antiviral pill made by Merck & Co. Prime Minister Scott Morrison made the announcement Tuesday.
These treatments means that we're going to be able to live with the virus. So even in the unfortunate situation, if you do contract the virus, then we'll have the treatments to ensure that we can lessen these symptoms, reduce the chance of you ending up on ICU, which can put pressure on the hospital systems.
The pill, named MOLNUPIRAVIR, would be the first oral antiviral medication for COVID-19 if it can get regulatory approval. Experts say it could halve the chances of dying or being hospitalised for people most at risk of getting severe COVID. Morrison said the capsules have to be taken twice a day for 5 days by adult patients for a course of 10. He also said the drug is expected to be available in Australia by early next year if approved by the country's drug regulator. Australia is stepping up its vaccination rate as its largest cities, Sydney and Melbourne, go through weeks-long lockdowns. The national first dose rate in Australia pushed past 80% on Tuesday morning. It comes as Victoria recorded the highest number of daily COVID infections of any state in the country since the start of the pandemic. 1,763 new infections were reported on Saturday. Australia has had some of the world's strictest border rules during the global health crisis, but aims to reopen next month for fully vaccinated citizens and permanent residents.
And to discuss this further, I'm joined live from Weston-super-Mare in England by Professor Parag Singhal, who's a consultant endocrinologist and National Secretary of the British Association of Physicians of Indian Origin. Professor Singhal, thank you so much for joining us here again today on The Edge. Now, some interesting news. The European Medicines Agency, among others, is talking of setting up a rolling trial for this new drug from Merck. Well, what is your reaction to this news?
I think this is quite exciting. And this could be another, put it this way, game changer along with vaccination. And it complements the vaccination program beautifully. Because just in case, in a very unfortunate situation, somebody does get COVID, and if it is taken early in the disease, the data is very, very strong. It reduces hospitalization or deaths by half. And in the interim analysis of phase 3 trial of 775 patients, none of the patients taking this drug early in the disease died, versus 8 patients dying in the placebo arm. So that's a very striking data, and that's why the phase 3 trial was halted after consultation with the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. And I think it is very likely that the regulators are going to approve this drug very soon. So this is going to be quite exciting, but there are some challenges. And one of the challenges is it has to be taken early in the course of the disease before the virus is spreading and enters your lungs. Because once it enters your lungs, it doesn't work. And this has been shown by previous trial, which actually showed no efficacy of this drug in hospitalized patients. So that's a bit of a challenge we have to overcome, and how do we administer this early in the disease?
It sounds like a particular challenge to follow up from testing, I imagine. You said very carefully it's a complement to vaccines. This drug doesn't replace them, does it?
No, not at all. I mean, I think the vaccination program has to continue simultaneously, including booster doses, because one of the advantages of vaccination program is it also reduces the likelihood of catching the infection, while this drug does not. So we have to be absolutely clear that this drug can only be used as a treatment early on in the disease, but not as preventive measure to prevent getting infection. So I think this is where the two working in tandem, in synergy, or complementing each other, would be fantastic news for the world. And I think we can finally, if this drug does get approval, we can finally look forward to living in the free world with free movement.
Which is something we all want. Could you explain to us what is the difference between a vaccine and this new word that's now entering our vocabulary, antiviral? What is an antiviral?
So antiviral is a drug which is basically medication targeting the enzyme, which reduces the viral replication in the body. And it introduces some genetic or errors in the genetic code. Therefore, virus is not able to multiply. While vaccination is completely different ballgame, introducing minute quantity of the virus, live antigen, to create immunity against the virus. So it is a very, very different methodology or mechanism of action. Yeah, it is quite exciting. And I think the challenge would be, quite often we are faced with symptoms which can be due to COVID or cannot be because of COVID. Now the question is, how do we differentiate? And with the current scenario of PCR still taking time, should we be taking this medication as soon as we start getting suspicious of symptoms of COVID? Perhaps that's the way forward, and that's the challenge we have to overcome.
Now, obviously, doctors around the world want to have as many different tools as they can to fight infections, to fight disease. And so, of course, this is an important element of that. But the key word there is around the world. Is this something which will be sucked up by the countries that have sucked up all the vaccines, or is there a chance that this drug will help the fight against coronavirus in less developed countries, particularly across Africa?
Yeah, I mean, that like with vaccine program, this is a challenge for less developed countries, because what we don't want is this medication to be, sucked up by all the Western or rich countries, and it doesn't reach the so-called poor countries. One of the things, I think there is still a significant proportion of people who are resistant to vaccine. And certainly for those people who don't want to take vaccine at any cost, this actually provides some relief to them, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. So that's an added. And I think this is something which all the world leaders and WHO have to come together, sit down, and create a system of world parity. Because as with vaccination, it is important that everybody in the world has access to this medication. And this can replace one of the other mechanisms or tools in our box, which is monoclonal antibody. So say, for example, that is available in India. And one dose is required as soon as you are suspected of having infection, but that's quite expensive. So in a way, there are multiple tools, as you say, and this clearly has got a lot of benefit to offer. But just wanted to emphasize one more thing. I think we should not forget the basics about COVID behavior and all the tools which we can use. And one of the tools, obviously, is as much ventilation as possible. And through this channel, one other thing which can be pretty effective is about the role of vitamin D. And that is something in the big scheme of things of vaccination and all the research innovation around new medication, it has been forgotten. There is ample evidence, of course, retrospective evidence, not gold standard evidence, but very good suggestion that adequate levels of vitamin D are likely to reduce the severity of the disease, including admission to intensive care unit. Now, that is something which is within the gift of the governments. And we know that large populations are deficient of vitamin D. We know that. Every population is deficient of vitamin D.
What is the normal source of vitamin D?
So vitamin D, the most important source is sunlight. The UV rays get absorbed by the skin, and therefore the dark-skinned people find it difficult to absorb, and the prevalence of vitamin D deficiency in dark-skinned individuals like coming from African, Indian or origin is 90%. But even in Western population, the prevalence of vitamin D deficiency is 50% because we don't go out in the sun enough. We wear clothes all the time. We are used to materialistic Western way of life. So it's a significant health problem in all the countries. And we have to embark on a proper replacement program to achieve normal levels of vitamin D. We are not talking about vitamin D being used as treatment of coronavirus. We are talking about keeping vitamin D to normal level to have normal bone health and have natural immunity in the system. So I think my message is that yes, we have got vaccines, yes, we have got this new medication, yes, we have got monoclonal antibody, but we should not forget our basic mask, our basic ventilation, and also vitamin D replacement program.
In fact, living a responsible and healthy life is the best way to protect against illness, is what you're saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, because natural immunity is the greatest fight against viral infection. That's the greatest asset anybody can have to fight against viral infection. So
wearing mask, washing hands, plenty of fresh air and sunlight. And these are all things that we need to focus on. Professor Singer,
sorry, I lost you.
Professor Singer, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful speaking with you. Thank you. If authorised by regulators, MOLNUPIRAVIR would be the first oral antiviral medication for COVID-19. The pill, which was originally developed to treat influenza, is designed to introduce errors into the genetic code of the virus, preventing it from spreading in the body. The coming days will show what the European Medicines Agency decision will be. Our analysts have provided their insights on today's top stories. Let's have a roundup of what they had to say.